have different cultures and different societies established an economy? How have they organized their food production, the work that goes into producing food, as well as the distribution of resources in the society? And what are some effects and consequences of doing so? For example, what does it have to do with societies being more or less egalitarian, more or less hierarchical? How do political structure go together, perhaps, with ways of producing food and organizing resources? Also, what are some of the very complex ways in which environment and ecologies and cultures shape each other? Because, of course, when you're thinking of making a living, you always have to consider the environment, but culture is not directly determined by their environment and ecology. There are many really interesting complex relationships going on there. And another really interesting question is also the question of value. How do cultures and society ascribe values to particular objects? And what does it mean for how exchanges perhaps take place and different kinds of distributions? So responding to the very first question, how have different societies and cultures organized their economy and their food production? Since the 1900s, anthropologists have described different kinds of modes of production that they have observed in different places. And these are some of the categories or some of the labels that they have used. They talk about pastoral societies, they talk about hunter-gatherers, they talk about horticulturalists, which also means small farmers. And of course, they talk about larger scale farmings and even industrial model of food production. And that is something that at least I am very familiar with, because the society we are living in right now is, depends in great part on industrial model of food production. And when you look at this different squares, it does feel a little bit like anthropologists wanted to put people and cultures in a box. But actually thinking about different economies and modes of food production, different strategies for making a living, has been really helpful for anthropologists to think of this complex relationship between economies, environment, and societies. And it has also been really useful for understanding perhaps some of the ideas and wider values and even philosophical underpinning that might be linked to different ways of making a living and organizing work. So hunter-gatherers are societies that do not cultivate plants and do not domesticate animals, although there is like a lot of gray areas around that, but mainly gather what is available. So wild plant foods that are available, as well they hunt animals and they fish. And hunter-gatherers, something to keep in mind is that this society has flourished in many very different environments, from polar region to rainforest to semi-desert regions. Because hunter-gatherer society depend on many different resources, and these different resources might vary from year to year, or from season to season, or even from place to place. Most hunter-gathering societies are either nomadic or semi-nomadic. And keep in mind that when we say this word nomadic or semi-nomadic, you might have in your head this idea that they just roam randomly around many different places. But it's more, think more of a different seasonal movement to make sure they can gather different resources in different places. And also what goes with it is that they do not want to deplete the resources that are available. So the idea of being nomadic and semi-nomadic is a strategy to use what is available and also to make sure that these resources continue to be available. Because hunter-gatherer society are nomadic or semi-nomadic and use what is available, usually land is not regarded as something that can be owned. And interesting things about hunter-gatherers is that they are sustainable societies. For one, it has been a type of economy that has been used for, we could say, the longest time in the history of humans. And for the others, as I said before, hunter-gatherers do not exploit the resources to the point of depletion. We also have to keep in mind that because they have little population density, this is also easier to do. As Kenyans really say, hunter-gatherers also have a flexible social arrangements, meaning that it is quite easy for groups to split up and go separate ways, for alliances to form, and they are usually egalitarian. This is another really interesting thing about hunter-gatherer society. They would have perhaps leaders or people who are particularly respected or that people listen to because they have a certain leadership skills or authority, but they don't have centralized government. They don't have centralized authorities, no bureaucratic system, no chief or institutional governments. And in this context, Kenyans really note that the fact that food is widely shared in these societies promotes egalitarianism because it is very difficult to have more than others and to accumulate wealth. In turn, egalitarianism promotes sharing, or as stated in your book, it makes it hard to dominate others and to resist sharing. And Pierre Clastre, who wrote a book about hunter-gatherer societies a while ago, I think in the 70s, says that they are societies against the state. They're not just egalitarian societies, but they are even against, like they are organized in such a way that prevents the advent of a centralized government or really authoritarian or hierarchical structures, because there are mechanisms in place in hunter-gatherer societies, making sure that nobody hoards foods or keeps everything for themselves or commands others. And if you think about the fact that hunter-gatherers do not really accumulate wealth and that resources are shared, it also makes sense because hunter-gatherers usually or traditionally have been moving around as nomadic and semi-nomadic people. So it really doesn't make sense to accumulate a lot of material possession and a lot of objects, because that would actually hinder you in your way of life rather than be a good thing. And that is also why in some hunter-gathering society there's a different idea of wealth. Perhaps wealth is seen as something more immaterial. It could be perhaps songs or stories that count as wealth more than a collection of objects that you have to lug around with you. And in the last 100 years or so, the biggest threat to hunter-gatherer societies has been basically nation states that want to prevent hunter-gatherers from moving around and also have taken away land and resources, so that it has become really difficult for hunter-gatherer societies to continue having enough resources to sustain themselves in such a way. Some strong misconception about hunting-gathering society. And one of them is that hunter-gatherers are living at the brink of starvation. this ethnographic research and anthropological research has proved that that is not the case, or not necessarily the case. Although there are some hunter-gathering society, especially in the last 100 years or so, that have had a really big hardship, as I said, because their land base has been taken away and perhaps their access to resources has been curtailed. Many anthropologists have found that in the past, hunter-gatherers actually could produce enough food in quite a short amount of time. And again, this really varies from society to society because hunter-gatherers are a very heterogeneous groups of societies. Marshall Saling, writing in the 70s, for example, called hunter-gatherers the original affluent society because, and he made the example of a Duansi, they can gather, in this quote he says that they can gather in one day enough food to feed a family for 3 days. And so that they have basically free times to do other things like visiting, take care of children, and, do some more recreational activities, so to speak, right? And that was the case also for the hunters that, it was difficult to hunt, but when they actually brought some meat home, then they did not need to do hunting for a little while and they had this free time. And that is why Saling said we have all of this misconception about hunting-gathering society as being such a harsh way of life. But that has to do more with, so to speak, a farmer stereotype towards hunter-gatherers than actually a careful analysis of their economy. Other interesting ideas in that respect is that the Hassa, for example, according to Saling, did not necessarily want to take on agriculture because it seemed like a really hard work that perhaps was a harder way of life and with more constraint and insecurity than hunter-gathering. And I really like this question collected by Lee about the Duansi. Why should we plant when there are so many mongongo nuts in the world? And mongongo nuts was one of the staples of Duansi people that they could gather, and it was a staple of their diet. So going to pastoralists, this is another type of societies that anthropologists have studied, and we have encountered the example of the Nuer in our previous weeks. So the Nuer are an example of pastoralists, and pastoralists are, to say it, with a word, they are herders. Their economy centers on having a herd, and the animal that they subsist on, of course, varies depending on the environment that the societies find themselves. And the animals usually does not just supply food, but they also supply tools, dung for fuel. Animals in the society are usually also at the center of exchanges. They are important symbols of wealth, and they also feature in ceremonies and in the spiritual life of these communities because they are very important for the society. Pastoralists usually have more than one animal because it makes sense in, if there is a sickness coming or something happens to a herd, it is just better to have more than just one kind of animal. So Nuer, for example, also had smaller animals like goats that they relied on and not just cows. And of course, pastoralists also engage in trade, just like hunter-gatherers as well. And many pastoralists also grow some food in, in gardens at the site. So for example, Nuers, as we have said before in the previous weeks, they grow, they have villages on ridges when it rains, when it is the rainy season, and they would grow vegetables and grain in those gardens as well. Pastoral societies also rely mostly on milk products rather than meat because of the need to preserve a herd, of course. And many of them are nomadic or semi-nomadic because they have to follow their herds in search of good pastures. They have to make sure that there are enough pastures for the animals in different seasons. And something interesting about pastoralists is also that they usually make a living in areas that are not really conducive for agriculture, either because of the climatic condition or because of the soils or because perhaps they are semi-desert. So it's also a really interesting human adaptation, so to speak, to harsh environments. Horticulturalists are the other label, so to speak, that I want to talk about a little bit here. And horticulturalists are small farmers, and they have fields that they cultivate for a little bit of time, and then they would leave those fields fallow or empty to recover, and they would move the fields elsewhere. And many horticulturalists use a technique that is called the slash and burn cultivation or shifting cultivation, and their fields are called swiddens. And what they do is that they would cut a forest, for example, a rainforest, and then they would burn that section of the forest in order to make a field and plant it. But after a few years, they would let the forest regrow in that part. And this practice can be sustainable if the forest is allowed to regrow, and basically if there is enough space for the amount of population that is using that space of those fields. And something really interesting is, as Singh explained for the Neratus forest dwellers in Indonesia, that swiddens, so the horticulturalists, the fields of slash and burn cultivations, that swiddens do not actually really deeply correspond to our views of wild versus cultivated. This is because in a Sweden, some crops are planted, but others, perhaps like fruit trees, are maintained and encouraged. So you have almost like a continuum of practices between welcoming what is already there and, encouraging it and cherishing it and planting other crops. And so rather than having only a few crops, Sweden have a wide variety of food. And Sweden and the forest are both prized for the diversity of food items. Similarly, G, who studied Lacandon Mayas in Chiapas in Mexico, describes how farmer would have sometimes more than 40 different plants across the field's location. And he writes that the Lacandon, in contrast, this is a quote from G, in contrast to monocrop agriculture as practiced in the United States, the Sweden of the Mayas, that are called milpa, attempts to maintain rather than replace the structure of a tropical rainforest system. In effect, the milpa is a portion of the jungle where a greater than normal population of food-producing crops have been concentrated. So think about it, this is really interesting, right? Rather than thinking of a field as something that is completely clear, and then you have 2 or 4 things growing, or perhaps even 10 different crops growing, the idea is that it is a part of a forest where you have a continuum between cultivated and what the forest is. And the diversity of plants that are in this Sweden are really appreciated because then you have a really interesting diet. And also, if one plant doesn't do well, then you have all of the others as well. But in this way, the forest and the field, so to speak, are more linked to each other than we might think when we think of farming.